once again, difference between a booty call and a butt dial, like contextual reading
Context
is helpful.
matters.
Okay.
In that regard, something I've seen brought up on the internet, a debate that I never really considered as a kid that I find fascinating.
There are debates on the internet?
Oh my goodness.
Okay.
Is the murder of the Canaanites. And this is something that gets brought up a lot. That basically you have this command by God to go into this land and murder all the people, men, women, children. And ostensibly some of them are innocent, but yet all of them need to be killed.
Right.
And people have kind of taken a bunch of different sides as like, oh, is God justifying genocide?
Right.
What do you make of that text?
As I'm sure most of you know by now, Wes Huff recently went on the Flagrant podcast. He was asked a ton of questions about God, Christianity, and the Bible. And of course, at some point, the call to drive out the Canaanites in the Old Testament was brought into this conversation. I would say this is probably currently the most popular objection to the Bible. And I also frankly think it's one of the most understandable objections. So in this video, we're going to feature Wesley's response to this objection. Then Michael Jones from Inspiring Philosophy is going to unpack this a little bit more with me. We're going to explore two separate explanations for this frankly very challenging portion of Scripture. So with all of that in view, let's begin.
So I don't think it's genocide in the way that we would understand genocide, specifically because the Canaanites continue to pop up. So if they did actually wipe everybody out, they did a poor job at it. There's a few things going on in the text. God promises Abraham Canaan and says, I'm going to give it to your descendants, but I'm going to wait 400 years because the sins of the Amorites have not come to their full fruition. So God gives them 400 years to repent. And by the time you get to like Joshua, they're not repenting. If anything, they've gotten worse, right? They're doing things like child sacrifice to these agricultural gods. And so then you have something unique in the Old Testament where before the monarchy, before like Saul and David, the kings, it's a theocracy. God is the ruler of the people, and he uses Israel to enact his judgment. So he enacts judgment on these terrible people in order to, so like in the same vein, a lot of people who say to me like, look, there's genocide in the Old Testament, also say things to me like, well, why doesn't God do anything about the evil in the world? I would actually argue this is an example of God doing something about the evil in the world, and that he's using his nation Israel to accomplish the wiping out of these people.
So he sees that as justice for what they've done wrong.
These are bad people.
Right.
And so I think there's an aspect of God is saying, go and wipe them out. I'm done with their evil. At the same time, there's a friend of the organization I work with, a guy named Paul Copan. He's in Florida. I think he teaches at Florida State University. He wrote a book called Is God a Moral Monster? And then he wrote another book called Did God Command Genocide in the Old Testament?
Paul Copan is actually a personal friend of mine, and he teaches at Palm Beach Atlantic University. His book, Is God a Moral Monster? And second book, Is God a Vindictive Bully? Dealing with this topic are really, really awesome. But I just wanted to kind of set the record straight there in terms of the university that Paul Copan is at. Let's keep going.
He goes through some interesting parallels in other ancient Near Eastern, so like Canaanite, Hittite, Egyptian war texts, where it uses similar language in terms of like wipe them out, leave none left, kill the women, the children, the goats, that kind of stuff. And Copan argues that there's an aspect of cultural wartime hyperbole that exists in the same way that I would say like the Toronto Maple Leafs murdered the Montreal Canadiens, right? There's an aspect of, if you didn't understand what I was talking about, I'm talking about hockey, I'm talking about a team. When I say murdered, I don't mean like that they were, like that we use these kind of phenomenological hyperbole in our language today. Like you killed at your last set, right? Like this kind of stuff makes sense.
Yeah.
And so in these kind of ancient Near Eastern texts, you have these levels of hyperbole, which could mean kill everybody, but doesn't always mean that. And we can compare them with like Egyptian steles or like wartime inscriptions from...
Does other hyperbole exist in the religious texts when it doesn't have to do with these type of severe situations? Like, are they hyperbolic about how fruit tastes?
It's a good question. I don't know if I know the answer
Because
to
if that hyperbole exists in these other areas that aren't as high stakes, then it would
Yeah,
make a lot
so-
of sense that it would exist when the stakes are high. But if it only exists when talking about genocide, it seems like people are trying to skirt accountability.
Okay, let me dive in here really quick just to give a couple examples of this to kind of answer Andrew's question. So Psalm 6:6 says, I am weary with my moaning. Every night I flood my bed with tears. I drench my couch with my weeping. I would say that's a little bit hyperbolic. Genesis 41:49, just to use another example. There's more than this, obviously. Joseph stored up grain in great abundance, like the sand of the sea, until he stopped measuring it, for it was beyond measure. So I'm sure that the amount of grain that Joseph stored actually equates to a certain amount of pounds, and that it is measurable. There are instances of hyperbole used throughout the Old Testament, in particular in the wisdom literature, but also, I would argue, in a story like the story here of Joseph. So let's keep going.
Right. No,
Or
we
something
do
from
we
the
do get
text.
that in the sense of like when you read the book of Jonah in Hebrew, you get these like there's almost like a comedic play to it, where when he does eventually get to Nineveh, which he doesn't want to go to because God says go to Nineveh, preach repentance. He doesn't want to go, so he tries to hike it in the other direction. And when he eventually gets there, it says that everybody repents, even the cows. And it's like it's hyperbolic, where it's saying like even the cows are sorry.
Yeah.
Like that's how much they're repentant of what they've done.
Okay.
So you got stuff like that.
Okay, so now I want to basically present two questions. One, are there good reasons to believe that this is hyperbolic language that's being used within this account of the driving out of the Canaanites? And two, is there any way to make sense of this if we are to take it literally? If you don't want to go the hyperbole route and you're going to take it literally, how else are we going to kind of wrap around our heads around that? And so Michael Jones and I are going to kind of unpack both of those angles. So let's dive in.
K. Lawson Younger Jr., okay, great Old Testament scholar. He says, while there are differences, the Hebrew conquest account of Canaan in Joshua 9-12 is by and large typical of any ancient Near Eastern account. So Joshua sounds like an ancient Near Eastern war conquest. Well, if we go and read some of those, we find something interesting. So the stele, the Gebel Barkol stele of Tutmosis III says this: the great army of Mitanni, it is overthrown in the twinkling of an eye. It has perished completely. Say that again. It has perished completely, as though they never existed, like the ashes of a fire. Okay, Tutmosis III fought the Mitanni Empire. They did not perish completely. His son Amenhotep II made a treaty with them. So they're obviously still around and have a standing army. This is ancient Near Eastern hyperbole. We see this in the Merneptah stele. This is the earliest inscription that mentions Israel. It says, Israel is laid waste, his seed is no more. Huru is become a widow because of Egypt. Okay. Again, ancient Near Eastern hyperbole. It's saying these were completely wiped out. They weren't. It's just saying they're defeated with strong language. The Mesha inscription mentions Israel. It says, Israel has utterly perished forever. Okay, that obviously was false. Mesha did not utterly wipe out Israel and leave behind no Jews. They obviously were still there. This is just ancient Near Eastern war hyperbole. Sennacherib says, the soldiers of Hirame, I think that's how you say that, dangerous enemies, I cut down with a sword and not one escaped. Okay, so we see this throughout. Nicholas Warterstorff says in Divine Evil, he says, we can call it a high geographic account of Joshua's exploits. The book is not to be read as claiming that Joshua conquered the entire promised land, nor is it to be read as claiming that Joshua exterminated with the edge of the sword the entire population of all the cities on the command of Yahweh to do so. K. Lawson Younger Jr. says in his book, Ancient Conquest Accounts, if scholars had realized the hyperbolic nature of the account in Joshua, if they had compared it with other ancient Near Eastern accounts of complete conquest, the image of the conquest as represented in Joshua would have emerged in a far clearer focus than it is. So what is it basically saying? It's basically saying they came in and they utterly defeated their enemies. They wiped them out. It was like no one was left, even though there were. And we see this in Joshua 10:20. It says, when Joshua and the sons of Israel had finished striking them with a great blow until they were wiped out, comma. Then it says, and when the remnant that remained of them had entered into the fortified cities. Wait a minute. I thought the first part of the verse said they were wiped out. And now you're talking about a remnant. Exactly. Because when we see in Joshua's conquest about everyone being wiped out, every man, woman, and child, that's hyperbole. Richard Hess talks about this in his commentary on the book of Joshua, when it talks about Jericho, everyone being wiped out, every man, the woman, the young to old. It's not saying they literally wiped out babies. It's just saying this exhaustively they were defeated and they sent them running. They killed all the warriors or anyone who stood against them. Again, I do not think Joshua's conquest meant they literally committed genocide and they wiped out babies. I think this is just ancient Near Eastern war hyperbole, and this is supported by the text of Joshua. You get to Joshua 23. What does it say? Well, we read, so it says, verse 9, for the Lord has driven out before you great and strong nations, and as for you, no man has been able to stand before you to this day. One man of you puts to a fight 1,000, since the Lord your God fights with you as he promised. Be careful, therefore, to love the Lord your God. For if you turn back and cling to the remnant of these nations remaining among you and make marriages with them, so that you associate with them and they with you, know for certain that the Lord your God will no longer drive out these nations before you. Okay, obviously, many of the nations are still there. They're able to continue producing because it says, hey, don't marry with them. Okay, we see also this in the first 2 chapters of Judges. A lot of the Canaanites are still there. So this is not about wiping people out. This is about Israel coming in, getting rid of the evil culture that did child sacrifice and cultic prostitution, and taking over and replacing it, that kind of thing. And we also see this in the book of Joshua. Rahab, for example, says, hey, I'll join with Israel. I'll help Israel. And she's spared. There's also a city as well that joins with Israel and they're spared. It's not this idea they were just supposed to literally commit absolute genocide. I think we have just interpreted these texts in modern lenses, not in the ancient Near Eastern context, and see as hagiographic hyperbole.
Okay, so I've heard Dr. Copan talk about this idea as well, and he's used a couple of verses where it's like, get rid of all the women and then also don't marry them. And it's kind of to prove your point. It doesn't fully add up. He talks about ancient Near Eastern trash talk and some of these similar ideas, which I'm open to that interpretation to some extent. But here, I guess would be just a clarifying question is, for me, that works in some of the descriptions of what took place. But when it comes to something where it's God himself talking and he's giving a command, you guys do this. If it's just, in other words, if you kind of bring that idea to the table, it doesn't really say what it sounds like it says, then isn't that also kind of opening up a huge problem of, well, what else then that God said isn't really what he said, or what is it about this that we should read that way versus the rest of the Bible? To me, it kind of opens up this crack in the sense of undermining the reliability of being able to trust that the text is saying what it says. Now, to be clear, I understand very much so that there's different genres in the Bible, and if you're reading Revelation, you shouldn't read it the same as if you're reading the Gospel of John. So I'm totally with you there. I just think that, well, I guess I would just want to push into that for a second to get your response to the idea of if it's sort of a quotes from God saying, kill the children. How is that not a slippery slope?
Well, it's not a slippery slope because God can also use the language we use to communicate to us. So in like Jeremiah 12, he tells Jeremiah, if you've raced with men on foot and they have wearied you, how will you compete with horses? Do we think he's telling Jeremiah, you're going to be racing horses soon? No, he's talking about, hey, you've been given tasks and you're wearied, but I have bigger tasks for you to do. So you better man up and get ready because there's more coming. He can use hyperbolic language, metaphors as well. Jesus does this. He says, get the log out of your eye before you get the speck out of someone else's eye. He's going to use the language of the day to communicate to the people of the day. God in the Pentateuch can do the same thing. He can use that type of language, and they understood it. And Paul Copan talks about this in his book, Did God Command Genocide? He actually addresses the very point and notes that in the context of those verses being used, they're always used in sort of like a way to talk about the hyperbolic aspect of driving them out of the land. So it's being used in that similar kind of way. So I don't think God is, we have to put him in a box and say he can only speak to or command things literally. I mean, if he told me, I need you to get to the hospital. Like, let's say God appeared to me and said, get to the hospital now, get in your car and drive down that road. I need you to fly. I'm not going to sprout wings. He's using the word fly to say, go fast. I think he can do the same thing with the ancient Israelites.
Or I guess to support your point, I am the door. I am,
Yeah.
Dr.
No.
Craig takes the approach of saying that basically because God commanded it, it is moral. And he takes a more literal approach, like the children really did die. And it leads into an interesting discussion where Alex O'Connor basically says, well, wait a second, isn't that one of those things that y'all Christians use to support the idea of universal objective morality? Isn't that just the type of example that you would use to talk about our shared moral intuitions? Because it's so obviously immoral. But now here you're saying God said to do it, and therefore, by definition, it is moral since God is the source of all good. Now, so this is now a little bit more philosophical and less textual, but I wanted to, given that you are a philosopher, as far as I understand, I wanted to run this idea by you to get your thoughts on if you think that this is legit, or if you would push back on this, or what your response would be to this type of dilemma for the people who aren't willing to do what you just did and who are actually going to go ahead and face this in a more literalistic way. This is what I was thinking about.
So it's a good question.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead. Yeah,
it's a good question. So here's a common question that you'll get in philosophy school. Like, if you had a time machine, but you could only go back to like when Hitler was a baby, would you kill Hitler? Would you kill baby Hitler? I mean, that actually comes up in the second Deadpool movie in the post-credit scene. Like, he goes back in time and can he kill baby Hitler kind of thing. It's one of those things. But it's a serious question to ask if you're going to look at this from a philosophical perspective. If you kind of go back in time, do you think it'd be the moral thing baby Hitler or not? What is your thought?
Personally, I think it's obvious. Yes. And
Okay.
I would go farther. I would say it would also be more moral to kill Hitler and his family if he prevented the Holocaust.
And that's where a lot of people fall, especially utilitarians. I honestly do not know the right answer because I'm a virtue ethicist. And so it's hard for me to make that kind of decision if that is the right thing. However, based on your normative ethical framework, it very well could be the right decision. So what's lacking in this conversation is, what is the actual normative ethical framework that we should have? Should we have a utilitarian framework where it's like the good is causing the greatest amount of happiness or pleasure for the greatest number of people? And so, like, you could make a case from it if you're going to be a utilitarian that, maybe actually from God's perspective, wiping out certain babies in this instance would be good because it's going to cause more happiness in the long term for greater number of people. If utilitarianism is true, you could make that case. It's much harder, though, if you're going to make it from a deontic case. So moral good for them is certain universal rules or universal laws that we have to hold to regardless. Like, it's always wrong to rape. It's always wrong to lie. This is, something that was proposed to Immanuel Kant. Like, the idea, what if an axe murderer shows up at your house and politely asks you to point him in the direction of your family so he can kill them? Of course, how would you respond, Immanuel Kant? Because you can't lie to him. So what do? So there's another instance where then it becomes, okay, is it an objective universal command to never kill an innocent life? What are the deontic rules that we have to follow to be moral or to be ethical? So what's missing in this, I think, is trying to lay down what is the actual normative ethical framework. And you got to figure that out before you can figure out what is good and what is not good. It's hard to really have these kind of decisions because everyone's coming at this with emotions. They're not thinking about these underlying philosophical issues that have not been sorted out yet. Going back to the whole Hitler example, do we go back and actually kill Hitler to prevent the Holocaust? Like, what if we actually knew from studying timelines that would actually make the world a better place? But there could be a case to be made that, yes, it's okay to kill baby Hitler at this point in time because you're going to save millions of lives. You're going to make the world a much better place in the long run. And so you could make that case in a virtue ethical framework or in a consequentialist framework. You could even make it in a deontic framework that somehow the circumstances make it so that the actual moral ought is that you have to act in this way. So there are those that need to be considered. You could also go back to Thomas Aquinas's view, which is called the doctrine of double effect. And this is an important thing to remember. So I have applied it to abortion in the past. So, what do you do if a woman is pregnant and you need to perform an abortion on her to save her life? So you're going to kill the child. Well, according to Aquinas' double effect, it can be the moral thing to do because you're having a double effect. You're not trying to kill the child, you're trying to save the mother. And inadvertently, it's creating a double effect in that the child dies. So you could have that, you could take that doctrine double effect and apply it here. You're not trying to necessarily cause harm or bloodshed. You're trying to save humanity, I guess you could say, or create a timeline where there's far more joy and happiness. You could have that kind of rules. But again, my overall is I don't think there actually were children killed in the Canaanite conquest. I think that's hagiographic hyperbole.
For what it's worth, I got to say this just for the sake of my wife, who's a nurse practitioner. She would say, to be clear, that is never a real ethical dilemma that practitioners are faced with. A C-section is always a better choice. But for the sake of the philosophy, I can see where you're going with that. I'll leave a link in the description where you can watch a documentary that I made. It's got Nabil Qureshi, Lee Strobel, William Lane Craig, and a bunch of other people in there that answer a lot of the questions that I've had about God over the years. I think you'll really like it, and it's totally free.